Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Reconstruction, Chapter 15 of our textbook. It's going to cover the years 1865 to 1877. Now, we're going to start off. After the Civil War, the North was going to give amnesty to most ex-Confederates. Basically, that's fancy for they were going to forgive them for what they'd done wrong, for leaving the Union, for fighting against the Union, all those things. The United States of America, the Union, allowed the rebellious states to return to the Union as soon as 10% of the voters had taken a loyalty oath pledging their loyalty to the United States of America. The states approved the 13th Amendment, which abolished or ended slavery. And by 1865, Southern state legislatures had basically, even though slavery was illegal, they'd basically restored it in everything except its name. So they had it, but it was called something differently. There were things called black codes, which would force former slaves back to the plantation labor. It was a way to get Americans back on the fields working and forcing them to work there. In March of 1865, the government created something called the Freedmen's Bureau, and exactly what it sounds like. It was a bureau or an organization that was there to help the freed men kind of transition back into life. Or not into life, but into free life. You know, teaching them basic skills of reading and writing and math and those types of things, and helping them try to get back on their feet. President Johnson vetoed bills to help the free slaves. He had some problems, racism and other things, and so even though they were trying to bring these freed slaves to equality amongst all, certain leaders, specifically President Johnson and others, were limiting that. February 1868, the House introduced, the 14th Amendment basically said that if you were born in America, you are now a United States citizen. So remember, 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, 14th made them citizens, and then the 15th is going to give voting rights to all men. February 1868, the House introduced the articles of impeachment against Johnson. They felt that he was doing some things wrong, especially with his lack of desire to help all these freed slaves. By February 1869, the 15th Amendment gives all males the right to vote, not women, and that is the problem here. Here we can see the drawing of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth there. He jumps over, runs away. They catch him a little while later. Here we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. These are known as the Civil War Amendments. Remember, 13th outlawed slavery, 14th made them citizens, 15th gave all men the right to vote. And here's an example of racism and those black codes and Jim Crow laws type things that they were dealing with. Here it says, we serve whites only, and the problems and the issues obviously that surround that, and we'll talk more about that in class. Here we can see one of the Freedmen's Bureau schools. Here they are. You can see there's white teachers there, but they're teaching African Americans, freed slaves of all ages, the basics of reading and writing, and there's going to be some math in there as well. And here we have President Johnson. Yeah. Alrighty. The meaning of freedom. Now, these freed people, they wanted voting rights and economic autonomy. They felt that the right to vote would lead them to have more success and freedom, and greater things would come for them from that. They also wanted jobs to be able to make money and buy their own things. President Johnson, he gave land back to the plantation owners in the South. After the United States had won the war, they had all this possessions. The landowners were gone, and they said, okay, here's your land back. And that upset the African Americans because they were the ones that were working on it. They were the ones that were dying on it. They were the ones that were suffering through it. They felt that they should have been given some compensation with that. Politicians hoped that the former slaves would just become wage earners on the cotton field. So basically, changing from a slave and not making money to being kind of like an employee and getting paid on the same fields. Many went back to work with their old masters, and basically their wages replaced the food, clothing, and shelter that slaves once had received. So now here you're given X amount of dollars or money, and now you need to buy food and clothes. You need to find somewhere to live, and it was very hard for them. There was this introduction of this thing called sharecropping, and I'll show you like a graph here in just a second. But the freedmen, these freed slaves, worked as renters. So they rented the land, exchanged their labor for the use of the land, house, implements, seed, and fertilizer. Basically, it was bad because it just kept the slaves in debt to the owners. And by 1893, out of four black farmers were sharecroppers. So if we start up here with number one, okay, the sharecropper, the freed slave, is given land. In exchange, they're given seeds and all that they need. The sharecropper buys food and kind of gets it on credit. You know, I'm going to do this for you if you give me these things. They plant their crop, they harvest it, they give what they owe to the sharecropper, and then they after that, then the sharecropper says, or the farmer, the owner of the land, excuse me, says, "Well, you owe me for this, this, and this," and ultimately, at the end, the sharecropper ends up with nothing, if not in more debt, and the cycle continues. And even though that freedman is free, he's still in debt to that slave owner. Excuse me, to that landowner. Here we have percentage of farms sharecropped. Obviously, you can see the blue is higher and increase, and this is kind of a sharecropper's land, how it would be broken up. All the different greens are kind of what they would grow and where. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau, the idea was to check for unfair labor contracts. So if a freed slave signed a contract, they would make sure that that was fair and equal. They advised on economic matters, you know, you have this much money, how to spend it, how to get it. They gave money to needy families. They established schools. The former slaves were getting involved in politics, which was a huge deal. They truly felt that their voice would be heard more if they were able to be involved in politics and those types of things going on. The Republicans viewed education as the foundation of a true democratic order. They felt that if these slaves, freed slaves, were given an education, that they would be able to prosper and grow. Um, Many felt that in order to be free meant that you could read a newspaper, you could sign a fair labor contract, you could read the books, the Bible, those types of things meant freedom to these people. Churches became central community institutions. The churches would turn into schoolhouses, turn into meeting halls, um, reception centers, all those different types of things. And the churches truly became a center for all these people. There was this idea to desegregate things, which means to have blacks and whites together, joined together, as opposed to segregation, which means they're separate. And by doing this, there was going to be backlash. People were not going to be happy with this. In 1875, they passed the Civil Rights Act, which said there was full and equal access for all, regardless of your skin color, access to jury service, transportation, public accommodations. Now, if we know anything about the civil rights movement, you know, less than 100 years later, transportation was one of those big, transportation and public accommodations were one of those big issues that was not equal and fair for all. Here we can see Freedmen's Bureau School. You have the teacher up front and the students in the back. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was rarely enforced and was eventually overturned by a Supreme Court decision in 1883. So even though they were trying and fighting for equality, the government, the people were not giving it to them. This whole time period was known as Reconstruction. It's the rebuilding of the South. They're trying to not only physically rebuild the South, buildings and different things, but get the freed men, the freed slaves, back into or incorporate them into society. Um, but eventually, the Reconstruction doesn't work. There was a financial depression, jobs lost wages, hit America in 1873. The Republican Party began to split over some political ideas and different things. The Grant administration, President Grant, was just full of scandals. He just had all kinds of problems, Ulysses S. Grant. The Republicans in the South went into hiding or fled for their lives because they were the ones that were promoting equality and fairness and for the freed slaves, and the people in the South were not happy with that. And so the only people who supported the freedmen in the South basically ran away hiding for fear of their life. The KKK, also known as the Ku Klux Klan, formed in late 1865 or 66. They burned freedmen schools, they beat teachers, they attacked Republican gatherings, they murdered political opponents. There were all kinds of problems going on with the KKK. They basically had control. And in some places, the KKK was the Democratic political party, where the Democrats also were KKK members. Here you can see, if you look at this, you have the KKK, and then you have something else called the White League, and their treatment, they're basically labeling it, they're worse than slavery. You can see the African American family there hiding for their safety. Here you can see an image of the KKK members. They're dressed in white, burning crosses, and we'll learn more about that too as history progresses. Now, the 1874 election, Democrats held power in the House of Representatives, and Mississippi was terrorized. The Republicans gave up their fight for the equality of all in Mississippi and other places down in the Deep South. By 1876, the Reconstruction period was over. Republicans are gone. They have no power. They have no influence in the South. The Supreme Court struck down parts of the 14th Amendment, which made all people citizens. In 1876, you have a presidential election, Hayes versus Tilden. Controversy with electoral votes in Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. But eventually, Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president, number 19, and there are people who wanted to redeem or purify the South and bring it back to what it once was, and they were able to do that through violence. So, as great as this idea of Reconstruction was, and as good as some of the things were overall, it wasn't successful. Here we can see Rutherford B. Hayes. So, we see Reconstruction started in 1865. We have the KKK. We have freedmen's bureaus. We have black codes. All these things that are going for and against these freed slaves. But ultimately, within about 10 years, it is over.